There's a line in my ledger I never crossed out, though I've crossed out plenty else in 40 years of bad debts and worse weather. It reads, in my own crabbed hand, October 9th, owed $214, settled in full. And every time my eyes catch it, I have to set the pen down and breathe, because the truth of that line would take more pages than I've got left in the book, and more honesty than I generally keep in stock. I'm going to tell you the truth of it now. Not because it makes me look good, Lord knows it doesn't, not at the start, but because I'm old enough that the things I used to think were worth holding onto have mostly turned to dust in my fists, and the one thing that didn't is the one thing I never expected and didn't ask for and couldn't, for the longest while, even bring myself to want. A man came to my ranch one autumn owing me money. He didn't bring money. What he brought instead near broke me, and then it remade me, and I have spent the years since trying to figure out which of those two things I should be more grateful for. Sit a while, let the coffee go cold if you have to. This one takes its time. She was barking at the gate the way she only did for strangers, not the high, glad yapping she gave the male rider, but something lower, a warning that rattled up out of her chest. I was in the barn with my arm to the elbow inside a heifer who'd gotten herself crossways trying to calve, and I'll tell you, there is no sound in this world less welcome to a man in that position than a dog announcing company. "Hush," I said. She didn't hush. I got the calf turned. It came out blue and still, and I worked at it the way my father taught me, rubbing a fistful of straw against its ribs hard enough to scratch, blowing into its slick nose, swearing at it low and steady the way you'd coax a stubborn fire. When the breath finally hitched into it and it shook its big wet ears and bawled, I sat back on my heels in the muck and felt that small clean thing you feel when you've pulled a life out of the dark. It doesn't last long, but it's real while it's there. That was when I heard the wagon. Now I should explain the kind of man I was that morning, because it matters, and because if I leave it out you'll think better of me than I deserve and the whole thing will ring false. My name is Wendell Carr. I was 53 years old that autumn, a widower of 9 years, and I ran 400 head on a hardscrabble stretch of land my grandfather had bought off the railroad for a price that turned out to be a swindle in his favor and everybody else's loss. I kept to myself. I kept my accounts in a black ledger I carried in my coat like other men carry a Bible, and I balanced it every Sunday whether the Lord approved or not. I trusted numbers because numbers don't lie to you, don't leave you, don't die in the night of a fever the doctor swore was nothing. Numbers just sit there and add up, and I found a great deal of comfort in that, the way some men find it in whiskey. And there was a number that autumn that wouldn't sit right, $214. That was what Ramon Vega owed me. He'd bought a string of horses off me in the spring, 8 head, good stock, broke gentle, on the promise of paying after he sold his own cattle in the fall. I'd known Ramon 11 years. He ran a small outfit 2 valleys over, him and his wife and a passel of children I'd never bothered to count. He was the sort of neighbor who'd ride 20 miles to help you mend a fence and then refuse the dollar you tried to press on him, and I'd always considered him a fool for it. A man who won't take what's owed him, I figured, is a man who'll someday have nothing. I was right about that as it turned out. I was just wrong about everything underneath it. Twice that fall the date had come and gone. Twice I'd ridden over and found the gate chained and the windows dark and no answer to my calling, and I'd come home angrier each time, because anger was simpler than the other thing tugging at me, which I didn't have a name for and didn't want one. So when I came out of that barn wiping calf blood and worse off my forearms and saw Ramon Vega's wagon standing in my yard, the first thing I felt, God forgive me, was not relief that the man was alive. It was satisfaction that I was finally going to get paid. He was sitting on the buckboard, not moving. The mule between the traces had its head down, blowing, lathered along the chest. They'd come hard and they'd come far. "Ramon," I called, "you're a hard man to find." He turned to look at me, and I stopped where I stood. I'd seen Ramon Vega gut shot once, in a hunting accident that should have killed him, and he'd looked better that day than he did sitting in my yard that morning. He'd lost weight a man his size shouldn't be able to lose. His face had gone the color of old tallow. There was a stillness on him I mistook at first for exhaustion, and only later understood for what it was, which was a man holding himself together by main force, because if he let go of any one piece the rest would come apart. "Wendell," he said, his voice came out cracked, "I don't have your money. I want to tell you I felt for him. I want to tell you I saw the state of him and forgot the ledger and helped him down off that wagon like a Christian. But I have promised you the truth, and the truth is that something in me went cold and hard, and I heard my own voice come out flat as a door slamming. Then you'd best tell me what you came for," I said, "because the mule's foundering and I don't keep a charity barn." He flinched. I watched him flinch, and I felt the meanness of it land, and I held my ground anyway, because 40 years of telling myself that softness was just the door that grief walks in through had made a stone of me, and a stone doesn't bend just because a thing in front of it is breaking. Ramon closed his eyes. When he opened them, he didn't look at me. He looked back over his shoulder into the bed of the wagon, at something I couldn't see from where I stood. "I have something worth more than the money," he said, "and I am ashamed of every reason I have for bringing it to you instead of keeping it, but you are the only man within 100 miles I would trust with this, even now, even after the way you are talking to me." He drew a breath that shook. "Maybe especially because of the way you are talking to me. A soft man would promise me everything and mean none of it. You will not promise me anything, but what you say you will do, you will do. I have watched you 11 years. You are a hard man, Wendell, and a hard man is what I need." I didn't know what he was talking about. I crossed the yard, irritated, the dog at my heel, and I looked over the side rail into the bed of his wagon. There was a child asleep in the straw. Girl, 6, maybe 7 years old. She had a man's coat thrown over her too big, and her boots had holes worn clean through the soles, and her face, even in sleep, had the pinched look of a child who has learned that hunger is a thing you carry rather than a thing that passes. One small fist was curled up under her chin. Her hair was black and matted, and someone, Ramon, I'd find out, with his clumsy, enormous hands, had tried to braid it and made a poor job and tied it off with a strip of red cloth. She wasn't his. I knew that at a glance. The Vega children were brown-eyed and round-faced like their mother. This child was something else. Apache, I thought, and the thought came with all the ugly freight that word carried in that country in those years, freight I'd loaded onto it myself without ever once examining the cargo. "Whose is she?" I said. And Ramon Vega, who had ridden 2 valleys and most of a night to land in the yard of a man who just threatened to turn him away over $200, put his face in his hands and wept. I made him come inside. I want that on the record, because it's about the only thing I did right in those first hours, and I've clung to it some over the years. I lifted the child down myself. She didn't wake, only made a small sound and turned her face into my coat, and I felt the lightness of her, the wrongness of how little a person that age ought to weigh, and I carried her into the house and laid her on the daybed in the front room that had been my wife's sewing corner, and that I hadn't let anybody sit on in 9 years. Then I sat Ramon down at my table and put coffee in front of him and waited. It came out of him in pieces, the way these things do, doubling back on itself. The same details told twice because the man telling them was past keeping his thoughts in a line. There'd been a sickness. Started in the spring, that was why the horses never got paid for, why the gate had been chained, why the windows had been dark when I rode over hot with my grievance. It had taken the youngest Vega first and then moved through the household like a hand sweeping crumbs off a table. Ramon's wife, 2 of his own children. He told me their names, and I'm ashamed to say I'd never learned them while they were living, so they came to me already as names of the dead, which is its own particular kind of grief, to mourn people you never bothered to know. "And the girl," I said, "she come with the sickness." She had not. The girl had come before all of it, the autumn previous, and here Ramon's story slowed and grew careful, and I understood he was choosing what to tell me and what to leave in the dark, the way a man does when he's protecting somebody, even a dead somebody, even a small living somebody asleep on a stranger's daybed. There'd been a band of Apache moving through the high country the winter before, not raiders. He was firm on that. Just people, families, hungry and harried and moving, because moving was the only thing left to them after the soldiers and the treaties, and the slow theft of every place they'd ever called home. One of them had died in the snow not a mile from Ramon's gate, a woman. And when Ramon went out to bury her, because you bury a body you find whether you knew it or not, that was the kind of man he was. He found the child beside her, half froze, too weak to run, watching him with the flat, exhausted eyes of an animal that has decided dying is easier than fighting. I could not leave her, Ramon said. You understand, I could not. My wife, his voice failed. He started again. My wife said God does not send a child to your door by accident. She took her in. We did not tell the agency. You know what they do, the agency, the schools, they take the children and he made a gesture, a cutting and erasing. We told the neighbors she was a cousin's child from down south. Some believed it. Some did not and said nothing, because they were good people, or because it was none of their business, which in this country amounts to nearly the same thing. What's her name? I said. We called her Ineacutes. He said it carefully, like a thing he was handing me across the table and was afraid I'd drop. Her own name, her people's name for her. She told my wife once and my wife wrote it down, but I cannot read it the way it should be said. It is on a paper in her coat. I did not want it lost. He looked up at me then, straight on, for the first time. That is what I came to ask you, Wendell, not for the debt. Forget the debt, I have nothing. I will work it off if God grants me years, but that is not why I am here. I am sick too. I have known it 3 weeks. I will not see the spring. He said it the way another man might say it looked like rain. I have no one left to take her. My sister in Sonora would take my own children. I have sent them ahead. That is why the wagon is empty but for her. But Ineacutes, he stopped. My sister is a good woman and a fearful one. She will not take an Apache child into a town that hangs Apache men. She told me so to my face, and I do not blame her. So I am left. And I thought of every man I know, and I thought of you. Why me? I said. I just threatened to put you off my land. Because you have no one either, Ramon said simply, and the plain cruelty of the truth in it went into me like a blade going in between ribs, sliding past the bone, finding the soft place I thought I'd walled off years ago. Because your house is empty and your heart is, forgive me, your heart is a ledger. You keep it balanced. You let nothing in because nothing can be taken from a room that is already empty. I have watched you bury yourself alive for 9 years, Wendell. And I thought, there is a man who has so much room, and here is a child who needs nothing in this world but room. And maybe God, who I do not understand and have stopped trying to, has been keeping you empty all this time for exactly this. Maybe that is mercy. It does not feel like mercy, but maybe it is. I didn't have an answer. There wasn't one. I sat in my own kitchen and I felt the whole careful structure of myself, the numbers, the balanced books, the cold, clean comfort of needing no one. I felt it shift on its footing like a barn in a hard wind. I can't take an Indian child, I said. It was the smallest, ugliest thing I could have said, and I said it because the truth was too big and the bigotry was the nearest small thing to hide behind. You know what this country is. They'd run me off the church rolls. The agency'd come. I'd lose. You would lose your standing, Ramon said quietly, among people you do not even like. I had no answer to that either. She woke at dusk. I'd sent Ramon to lie down in the spare room. He could hardly stand by then, and I'd half carried him, feeling the heat of the fever coming off him, knowing in some clinical corner of my mind that he was right about the spring, that I was holding a dying man under his arm, and I'd come back to the front room to look at the child the way you'd look at a problem you've been handed and can't set down. She was awake and watching me. She didn't make a sound. That's the thing I remember. A child that age, waking in a strange dark room in a strange house, ought to cry, ought to call out. She didn't. She lay perfectly still with her black eyes open and fixed on me, and I understood, the way you understand a thing in your gut before your head catches up, that she had learned silence the way other children learn their letters, that somewhere in her short life, making noise had become dangerous, and she'd taught herself out of it. The stillness of her was the worst thing I'd seen all that long day, worse than Ramon's tallow face, worse than the holes in her boots. "You're awake," I said, stupid. She just looked at me. "I didn't know what you said to a child. I'd never had any. My wife and I had wanted them and they hadn't come, and then she'd gone, and the wanting had folded itself up small and gotten put away with everything else." I stood in the doorway feeling enormous and useless, a stone in the shape of a man. There was a heel of bread on the sideboard from my noon meal. I picked it up and crossed the room slow, the way you'd approach a horse that's been beaten, and I crouched down a few feet from the daybed and held it out. She looked at the bread, she looked at me, she did not move. I set it down on the floor between us and backed off and sat in the chair by the cold stove and made like I was paying her no mind, looking instead at my own hands, which still had calf blood in the creases of the knuckles. I heard the straw of the daybed shift. I heard small bare feet on the boards. I heard the bread disappear, not bitten, snatched, the whole of it gone in one motion. And when I looked up, she was back on the daybed, pressed into the corner with the bread held in both fists against her chest, eating it in quick small bites with her eyes never once leaving my face. I have seen a great many things in my life. I have seen men die and cattle drown, and the prairie burn from one edge of the sky to the other. But I have never, before or since, seen anything that did to me what that did, that child eating a heel of stale bread like it might be taken from her, watching the man who'd given it like he was the likeliest one to do the taking. Something in my chest that had been closed a long time made a sound like a hinge that's rusted shut, and starts, against everything, to turn. I didn't say anything. I sat with her in the dark while she ate, and when she was done, I got up slow and brought her a cup of milk and set it down and backed away again. And we did the whole dance over, the watching and the waiting and the snatching, and somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I'd been holding my breath the way you hold it watching something fragile that might still break. That's how the first night went. Her in the corner of the daybed, me in the chair by the stove, neither of us sleeping much. The dog lying in the doorway between us like she'd appointed herself to the situation. And down the hall, Ramon Vega coughing in the dark, working through the last of his strength to do the one thing he had left to do, which was to make sure that when he went, the child went on. I want to tell you, I made up my mind that first night. That the sight of her eating that bread cracked the stone clean open, and I rose up a changed man. It wasn't like that. Change isn't like that, not the real kind. The real kind comes slow and against your will, and you fight it the whole way, because the man you've been has put a lot of work into being himself, and he doesn't give up the ground easy. What I did that gray morning after was take out my ledger. I sat at the table with the child watching me from the doorway now. She'd ventured that far, and I opened to the page with Ramon's debt, and I looked at the number a long while. $214. I'd ridden over twice that fall to collect it. I'd lain awake nights turning it over. I'd let it make me cruel. And down the hall, a man was dying who'd buried his wife and his children and a stranger's child's mother in a single year, and had spent the last of himself driving a foundering mule across 2 valleys, not to escape any of it, but to make sure that one small silent girl would have a roof when he was under the ground. I sat there with the pen in my hand for the better part of an hour. Then I drew a single line through the number, not a scratch out, a line, clean the way you close an account that's been settled, and in the margin in my crabbed hand I wrote the words I told you about at the start, the ones I never crossed out. October 9th, owed $214, settled in full. It wasn't true yet. Not the way I'd come to understand it later. At the time I only meant I was forgiving the debt, which felt like the largest thing a man like me could do, and felt, even as I did it, smaller than it should have been. I didn't know yet what was actually being settled, or who was paying whom, or that the account I just closed was about to open into something I'd spend the rest of my life unable to balance and grateful every single day that I couldn't. The girl in the doorway watched me close the book. I looked up at her, and for the first time I tried to smile. It came out wrong, I'm sure, a stone learning an expression it had no practice at, but I tried it, and I held out my hand across the table, palm up, empty, the way Rahman had taught me without ever knowing he was teaching it, the way you offer a thing to someone who has only ever had things taken. "Any acutes?" I said. She didn't take my hand, not that morning. But she didn't look away either. And down the hall the coughing had gone quiet, and I didn't yet know whether that quiet was rest or something worse, and I sat there with my hand held out across the table toward a child who was deciding, in her own time, in her own silence, whether the world had any more reason to be trusted than it had given her so far. Ramon Vega died on the fourth morning, and he did it the way he'd done everything else I ever saw him do, quietly, and with more grace than the situation deserved. I'd been sitting up with him. By then he couldn't take water without it coming back up, and the fever had him talking to people who weren't in the room, his wife mostly, in Spanish, gentle things, and once near the end, a long murmured conversation with someone he called matter that I had no business overhearing and have never repeated. I sat in the dark and held a cool rag to his head and felt the helplessness of a man who is good with horses and numbers and almost nothing else. Around the gray edge of dawn he came back to himself. It happens sometimes at the last. The fever lets go its grip for an hour and the man surfaces, clear-eyed like a swimmer coming up. "Wendell," his voice was thread-thin, "is she sleeping?" "She's sleeping." She was, finally, after 3 nights of that terrible watchfulness. The child had fallen into a real sleep on the daybed, the dog curled against her back, and I'd thought, looking at her before I came in to sit with Rahman, that's something. Whatever else happens, that's at least something. "Good." He closed his eyes. "I need you to do a thing for me, and you will not want to do it." "Name it." "When I am dead you must not take me to the church in town." His hand found my wrist, the grip of it nearly nothing. "They will ask about the girl. The priest is a good man but a frightened one, and frightened men talk. You will bury me here on your land. No marker that says my name, or they will come looking for the wagon and then the girl." His eyes opened. "You understand what I am asking. I am asking you to put a man in the ground like a dog so that a child can disappear." "I have no right to ask it I do." I did understand. And God help me, the first thing I felt, I keep telling you these things because a confession with the ugly parts left out isn't worth the breath. The first thing I felt was the cold, practical relief of a man who'd been dreading a trip to town. Because he was right. If I rolled into town with Rahman's body, I'd have 100 questions to answer, and the truest answers would put a noose around something I was only just beginning to understand I cared about. "I'll bury you here," I said, decent, with words over you, just not your name out loud. "Words?" He almost smiled. "You don't strike me as a man of many words, Wendell." "I'll borrow some." He did smile then, and it cost him, and it was worth what it cost. "There is a paper," he said, "in her coat, her name, her real name, the one her mother gave her, and below it my wife wrote what little the woman told her before she died, where the band was going, the name of the woman's brother if he lives. I could not read it well, but it is there." His fingers tightened, the last strength he had. "If a day comes when it is safe, and I do not think it will come soon, I think it will be a long time, longer than my life and maybe longer than yours, but if it comes and her people can be found, you must tell her the truth and let her choose. She is not a thing you are keeping, Wendell. She is a person you are holding for a while. There is a difference, and you are exactly the kind of man who could forget it, because you are a man who likes to keep things. Promise me you will remember the difference." I have made a few promises in my life. I broke some. This one I have kept, though keeping it has cost me more than the breaking of the others ever did. "I'll remember," I said. "And one more. His voice was going. The clear hour was closing over him. Do not let her be ashamed of what she is. The schools, the agency, they will tell her that what she is a thing to be cut out and thrown away. Everyone she meets will tell her this in 100 small ways without even knowing they are saying it. You cannot stop the world from saying it, but you can be one voice that says the opposite. You can be the floor she stands on when everything else is telling her to disappear. He swallowed. She has a way of going quiet and small when she is afraid. You will see it. When you see it, that is when she needs you to be loud. Be loud for her, Wendell. You owe me nothing. The debt is yours to forgive. But this, be loud for her, this is the only payment I will ever ask, and I am asking it of the quietest man I know. He didn't say anything after that. The fever took him back and held him, and around mid-morning his breathing changed, the way it does, and then it stopped, and the room was very quiet, and outside a meadowlark was carrying on like the world hadn't lost anything at all. I buried him in the cottonwood draw down by the creek, where the digging was soft and the shade was good, and a man could lie and listen to water if the dead listened to anything. It took me most of the afternoon. I'm not a young man, and the ground fought me even where it was soft, and I was glad of the fight, because it gave the grief somewhere to go. The girl watched from the lip of the draw the whole time. I told her, clumsy, not knowing how much English she had, finding out she had more than she let on, that Ramon was gone, that I was putting him in the ground, that she could come down or stay up as she liked. She stayed up. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest and the dog beside her, and she watched me dig her last protector into the earth. And she did not cry. And the not crying was a thing I was coming to understand about her. The way she held grief, the way she held everything, close and silent and braced against being seen. When it was done, I stood at the foot of the mound with my hat in my hands, and I tried to find the borrowed words I'd promised. I'm not a churchgoer in my heart, whatever the rolls in town might say. But I'd buried my wife and I knew the shape of the thing, so I said the parts I remembered, and then I ran out, and I stood there feeling the inadequacy of it. And then I don't know what moved me. I said the rest of it plain, to the man in the ground, the way you'd talk to him across a fence. You were a better man than me, Ramon. You knew it, and you never once rubbed my nose in it, which is more than I'd have managed in your place. My voice did something I didn't expect. You rode here owing me money, and you handed me the only thing you had left in the world that was worth anything, and you trusted me with it, and I don't know why, because I gave you no reason to. I'm going to try not to make a liar of you. That's the most I can promise. I'm going to try. The girl had come down the draw without my hearing her. She did that, moved like weather, like you'd only notice she'd arrived once she was already there. She stood beside me at the foot of the grave, small, the man's coat hanging off her, and she looked at the turned earth a long moment. Then she reached up and took my hand. I have told you I am not a man given to weeping. I'll only say that I was glad there was no one but a dog and a fresh grave to see me that afternoon, and leave the rest to your imagining. The trouble started 11 days later, and it came, as trouble in that country usually did, dressed up in concern for my own good. A writer came out from town, Cowboy, who held paper on half the small outfits in the county, and considered himself a pillar of things on the strength of it. He sat his horse in my yard and made small talk about the weather and the cattle prices, and I stood there knowing he hadn't ridden 11 miles to discuss the price of beef, and I waited him out the way you wait out a man who's circling. "Heard you took in a child," Calloway said finally, easy, like it had just occurred to him. "Did you?" Vega's folks figured before the sickness got them. He shifted in his saddle. "Sorry business that. Whole family near enough wiped out. They were good people, the Vegas, for he caught himself. He'd been about to say for Mexicans, and even Calloway had the sense to swallow it on a man's own land. Good people," he finished. "They were. Thing is, Wendell," here it came, "folks are saying the child's not Vega's at all. Folks are saying she's an Indian, Apache." He let the word sit there. "Now I don't put stock in talk, but the agency does. There's a man named of Brant come through, government man, collecting up Indian children for the schools. It's the law now, you know. They got a whole system, and somebody's gone and mentioned your situation to him. So I thought, being neighborly, I'd ride out and let you know. Get ahead of it. If there's a misunderstanding, better it gets cleared up quiet than have a federal man come knocking. You understand? I understood. I understood that this was the moment Rahman had been dying to get ahead of, arrived right on schedule, and I understood that I was standing at a place where the road forked, and that one fork was easy and one was hard, and that I had spent 53 years taking the easy one every chance I got. The easy fork was right there, smooth as a river stone. You're right, Calloway, misunderstanding. She's a cousin's child from down south. Vega took her in. I'm just keeping her till the sister sends for her. No Indian about it. Spread that around, would you, neighbor, and much obliged. It would have cost me nothing. It might even have worked. And it was exactly the kind of lie a careful man tells to keep his standing among people he doesn't even like. I thought about Rahman saying that. You're standing among people you do not even like. I thought about being loud. I'm not going to tell you I'd become a brave man in 11 days, or a good one. I was still mostly the stone I'd been. But somewhere in those 11 days, between the bread and the grave and the small hand reaching up to take mine, the arithmetic had changed. The thing I'd have lost by lying had gotten bigger than the thing I'd lose by telling the truth, and a man who trusts numbers eventually has to follow them where they go. She's mine, I said. Calloway blinked. Come again. The child, she's mine. I've taken her on. I'll be raising her. I heard my own voice go flat and hard, the same flatness I'd used on Rahman that first morning, only this time aimed the other way, like a gun turned around in my hands. Whatever she is or isn't is no business of yours, nor Brant's, nor the agency's, nor anyone in that town. She lives on my land and eats at my table, and there's an end to it. Wendell, Calloway's easiness had gone. You can't keep an Apache child. It's not, there's law about this. They'll come. Let them come. You'll lose everything, Calloway said, and he wasn't even threatening me. That was the thing. He honestly thought he was warning a friend off a cliff. The church'll cut you. The bank'll get nervous about your paper. You think folks'll buy beef off the man harboring an Indian. You'll be alone out here, Wendell. More alone than you already are, and God knows that's saying something. And there it was, the truest thing anyone said to me that whole year, dropped careless from the mouth of a man I didn't even like. You'll be alone out here, as if I weren't already. As if the empty house and the balanced ledger and the 9 years of needing no one had been anything but the loneliest kind of arithmetic, dressed up as strength. Calloway, I said, I have been alone out here for 9 years. I built it on purpose, brick by brick, because I decided that needing nobody was the same as being safe. I looked back toward the house, where I knew, without seeing her, that the girl was watching from the window the way she watched everything, braced and silent and small. And then a dying man handed me the one thing I couldn't keep balanced in a book, and I find I'd rather be run off this land with her than keep every acre of it without her. I can't explain it to you. I can't hardly explain it to myself. But that's where I've landed, and you can carry that back to town and to Brant and to anybody else who's interested. Calloway looked at me a long while. Whatever he saw, it wasn't the Wendell car he'd ridden out to warn. He gathered his reins. They'll come, he said again, quieter. I'm sorry, Wendell, you're making a hard road for yourself. It's the only kind I've got left, I said. Ride safe. He rode. I watched the dust of him out to the gate and down the long grade toward town, and when he was gone I stood in the empty yard and let the size of what I'd just done settle onto me, and it was large, and it was frightening. And underneath the fear there was something I hadn't felt in 9 years that took me a moment to even recognize. It was the feeling of being on the right side of a thing. The cost of it hadn't come due yet, but I knew it was coming, and I knew I'd pay it, and there was a strange, clean steadiness in that, like the steadiness you feel when you finally set down a weight you'd been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of you. The cost came due over the following months, and it came the way Calloway said it would, in pieces, each one small enough that no single one would break you, and all of them together meant two. The church cut me. Not out loud, they were too polite for out loud, but the invitation stopped, and the men who used to nod stopped nodding, and one Sunday I rode in for supplies and the preacher crossed the street rather than meet me, and I stood there in the road and understood that I had been weighed in some collective scale and found wanting for the crime of feeding a child. The bank got nervous, just as predicted. Two buyers who'd taken my beef for years suddenly found other suppliers. A fence got cut one night, not the whole line, just enough to scatter 40 head into the breaks and cost me a hard week gathering them. A message rather than a real injury, but a message all the same. I found a dead coyote nailed to my gatepost one morning with a scrap of red cloth tied to it, and I understood that someone had heard about the strip of red cloth in the girl's hair, and I took the thing down and buried it before she could see, and I went into the barn after and stood a long while with my forehead against a stall door, shaking, not with fear exactly, with something hotter than fear. I'd be lying if I said I never wavered. There were nights I lay awake doing the old arithmetic, the buyers lost, the standing gone, the slow strangling of a small ranch that depends on a community that's decided to starve it, and the cold part of me, the ledger part, would whisper that it wasn't too late, that I could still send her to the sister in Sonora, that no one would blame me, that I'd tried. And then I'd hear her down the hall. Because the thing about the girl was that she was, slow as spring, coming to life. The silence was lifting off her by degrees. She'd started to talk English mostly, picked up quicker than I'd have believed, and some words in her own tongue that she'd say to the dog when she thought I couldn't hear, soft, like keeping something alive. She'd started to laugh, which the first time near stopped my heart. The sound of it so unexpected in that house that I came in from the yard at a run thinking something was wrong, and found her on the kitchen floor where the dog had knocked her flat and was washing her face with its tongue, and she was laughing, helpless, both hands fisted in the dog's ruff, a child's whole body laugh, and I stood in the doorway with my heart going like a hammer and thought, this is what they want me to give up to keep my standing. This. She'd taken to following me, out to the barn at the dark of morning, sitting on an upturned bucket watching me milk, learning the work by watching the way she learned everything. She'd taken to leaving things. I'd find a smooth stone on my pillow, a feather laid careful on the seat of my chair. Small offerings I came to understand were her way of saying things she didn't yet have the trust to say out loud. I kept every one of them. I keep them still. They're in a cigar box in the drawer with the ledger, and they are worth, in the only currency that has ever finally mattered to me, considerably more than $214. So no, I didn't send her to Sonora. The nights I wavered, I'd waver, and then morning would come and she'd be on her bucket in the barn waiting for me with that grave attention, and the wavering would burn off like frost. Brant came in the dead of winter. I'd known he would. He came in a buggy with a driver and a deputy on a led horse, and he came with papers, and he came with the law on his side, which is the worst kind of man to face because he doesn't even have the decency to know he's the villain of the thing. He was a soft-handed man with spectacles and a tired, reasonable manner, the manner of a man who has done this many times and has long since stopped seeing the children as children. "Mr. Carr," he didn't get down, "I'll come to it. You're harboring an Indian child in violation of federal direction. By law, she's to be enrolled in the agency school where she'll be educated, civilized, and prepared for a productive life. I have the authority to take custody. I'd prefer to do it without unpleasantness." The girl was in the house. I'd seen to that the moment I saw the buggy on the grade, sent her to the root cellar with the dog and a candle and told her, in the new shorthand we'd built between us, quiet, and don't come out, no matter what, until I come for you. And she'd gone, silent and braced and small, gone back to the going small that Rahman had warned me of, and I'd watched her shrink into it and I'd heard the dead man's voice plain as if he stood beside me. "When you see it, That is when she needs you to be loud. So I was loud. I won't set down every word of what I said to Brant in my yard that winter morning, because some of it isn't fit for paper and the rest wouldn't sound, in the retelling, like the thing it was. I'll only tell you that I stood between that buggy and my house, and I told a federal man that he'd take that child over my dead body and not 1 minute before, and I told him exactly what it would cost him in trouble and time and noise to make that happen. And I told him I had nothing left to lose that mattered, no standing, no church, no buyers, no friends, that they'd already taken all of it, and the only thing they hadn't taken was the thing he'd come for. And that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of man there is, and that he should think long and hard about whether one Apache child was worth what I was prepared to make it cost him. Brant looked at me through his spectacles. The deputy's hand had drifted toward his hip and gone still, because even he could see this wasn't going the easy way. "You understand I can return with more men," Brant said. "You understand I'll still be here," I said. "And so will the trouble. I've got nothing but time and spite, Brant. You've got a whole territory of children to round up. You really going to spend your winter on one ranch and one stubborn old man over one child, when there's 100 easier ones down the road? Or are you going to do the arithmetic a reasonable man does, and decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth, and go find your numbers somewhere they come easy?" I'd gambled on him being exactly what he looked like. A reasonable man. A man of arithmetic. The most dangerous kind in his way, but predictable, because a man who runs on arithmetic can be shown a sum that doesn't favor him. He sat there a long, long moment. The cold came down off the mountains, and the horses blew steam, and somewhere under my feet, in the dark of the root cellar, a child sat with a candle and a dog, and waited to find out whether the floor she stood on was going to hold. Brant took off his spectacles. He cleaned them on a cloth, slow, a man buying himself a moment. "You're making a record of yourself, Carr," he said. "Men like you, there's a record being kept." He put the spectacles back on. "Drive on," he told his man. And the buggy turned in my yard and went back down the grade, and the deputy followed, and I stood in the snow until the last of them was gone past the gate, and then my legs went out from under me, and I sat down hard in the cold and stayed there shaking until the dog came up out of the cellar. She dug under the door. She always could, and pressed her cold nose to my face. And behind her, small, braced, half afraid to come up into a light that might still turn out to hold danger, came the girl. She looked at the empty grade where the buggy had been. She looked at me sitting in the snow. "They're gone," I said. My voice wasn't steady. "It's all right, they're gone." And she came and sat down in the snow beside me, close, her shoulder against my arm, and we sat there together in the cold while the steam of the horses thinned and vanished. And she put her small hand over my big one where it rested on my knee, and she didn't say anything, and neither did I, because some things are past words, and we'd both of us, in our different ways, always known it. I didn't know then that Brant would be back. I didn't know what the record he'd spoken of would cost us down the years, or what was still coming, or that the hardest choice was not the one I just made but one still waiting for me a long way off, on the far side of years I couldn't yet see. I only knew that the buggy was gone, and the child was beside me, and the floor had held. Years go by faster than anyone tells you, and faster still when you're happy, which is the cruelest part of happiness, and the part nobody warns you about. Brant didn't come back, not himself. The arithmetic held I was more trouble than I was worth, and there were easier numbers down the road, and he went and found them. But the record he'd spoken of was real. I'd learn, a name in a ledger of his own, and a man's name in a government book is a seed that can lie dormant a long while and still come up. I didn't think about it much in those years. A man doesn't when the sun's out. He thinks the weather will hold because it's holding now. The town's slow strangling eased, not because the town softened but because it got bored. Spite, like everything else, needs feeding, and when I refused to feed it, refused to leave, refused to crawl, just kept on raising beef and minding my own and being stubbornly, unremarkably present at the edge of their lives, it thinned out. A buyer came back, sheepish, talking prices like nothing had happened, and I sold to him because a ranch has to sell to somebody and pride doesn't fatten a calf. The church never took me back, and I never asked. By the time Ineacutes was 12, there were folks in town who'd plumb forgotten there'd ever been a fuss, and a few who'd decided, in the comfortable way people do, that they'd been on my side all along. She grew. That's the plain miracle of it, and there's no fancy way to say it. The silent braced child who snatched bread and went small at the sight of strangers grew, year on year, into someone I could hardly have imagined that first gray morning. She grew tall and quick and sharp-tongued. She got the sharp tongue from me, I'm afraid, and aimed it at me more than anyone, which I deserved and secretly treasured. She could ride anything with 4 legs by the time she was 10. She kept her own set of books for the ranch by 14, neater than mine, and caught me in 2 arithmetic errors the first month she did it, and never once let me forget either one. And she did not forget what she was. That was the thing I'd promised Ramon, the hardest thing, harder than facing Brant, because facing Brant was one morning and this was every day. Do not let her be ashamed of what she is. The world kept up its 100 small ways of telling her to disappear, the looks in town, the things said and unsaid, the school I never sent her to and the one I taught her from instead, at the kitchen table, sums and letters and how to read the ledger and the brand book. And against all of it, I did the one thing I'd promised. I was loud. Loud isn't always shouting. Mostly it was small. It was using the name her mother gave her, the one off the paper, the one it took me a year to learn to say right and Ineacutes a longer year to be willing to hear, alongside the name Ramon's wife had given her, so she'd grow up knowing she had 2 and both were hers and neither canceled the other. It was telling her, when she asked, everything I knew about where she came from, which wasn't much, and admitting when it wasn't much, and never once pretending the not much was the whole of her. It was keeping the paper. I want to tell you about the paper now, because it's time, and because everything else has been leading here whether I wanted it to or not. I'd put it away that first winter, in the cigar box with the smooth stones and the feathers, folded in the strip of red cloth. Ramon's wife's hand, careful, a schooled hand learning to write down sounds it had no letters for, the girl's true name, and below it in fainter pencil, what the dying woman in the snow had managed to tell her before she went. The band had been making for the high country to the north and west, trying to reach kin across a line on a map that the army was busy erasing. The name of a man, her mother's brother, the note said, if he lives. I never hid the box from Ineacutes, but I never put it in front of her either, and there's a kind of hiding in that, a coward's kind, and I knew it. Because here was the truth I carried in my chest like a stone for years, heavier each year as I came to love her more. The paper was a door, and on the other side of the door were her people, the ones the world had spent its whole strength trying to cut her off from, and I was the man holding the door shut. Not by force, by silence. By letting the years go by and the paper stay folded and the question stay unasked, because every day it stayed folded was a day she was mine, and I had spent 50 years being a man who liked to keep things, and the worst of me had never died. It had only learned to wear love as a disguise. She is not a thing you are keeping. She is a person you are holding for a while. Ramon had seen it in me before I'd ever felt it. He'd named the exact shape of the sin I'd commit and made me promise against it. And for years I'd kept the easy half of the promise, be loud, raise her proud, while quietly breaking the hard half every single day the box stayed shut. She found out about the paper when she was 17. She found it the way young people find everything you mean to tell them later, by accident, before you're ready, at the worst possible moment, which is to say the only moment you'd ever actually have done it. She was looking for the brand book in the drawer and her hand went past it to the cigar box, and she opened it because she was 17 and it was there. And she found the stones she'd left on my pillow a decade back, which made her laugh, and the feathers, which made her go quiet. And then she found the paper folded in the red cloth, and she went a kind of still I hadn't seen on her since she was small. I came in from the yard, and found her sitting on the floor with it open in her lap. "What is this?" she said. I could have lied. The old smooth fork in the road was still there. It's always there. It never goes away no matter how many times you don't take it. I could have said it was nothing, papers of Ramon's, I'd tell her sometime. And she'd have known I was lying because she always knew, and the lie would have done a worse thing than the truth ever could. I sat down across from her on the floor. My knees aren't built for it anymore, and I did it anyway, and I told her. All of it, the woman in the snow, the brother across the erased line, her mother's name for her written in a dying friend's wife's careful hand, Ramon's promise extracted from me with the last clear hour of his life. And then the part I'd never said to anyone, the confession I'd been carrying since the first winter, that I'd kept the paper folded on purpose, that I'd told myself it wasn't safe, it wasn't time, the country was too hard, all of which was true, and that underneath the true reasons was the other one, the ugly one, the keeping, that I'd been holding the door shut, that I was sorry, that she'd had a right to this paper, and the door it opened from the day she was old enough to read it, and that I'd stolen years off that right out of a love that was, at its root, partly just the old greed of a man who liked to keep things. She listened the way she listened to everything, grave and complete, her whole attention on me. The dog, a different dog by then, the first one long buried up the draw near Ramon, lay between us like the first one used to. When I was done, she didn't say anything for a while. Then she folded the paper back into the red cloth, careful, the way Ramon had folded it, the way her mother's friend's wife must have folded it, 3 sets of hands now in the keeping of it. "You're an old fool," she said. Her voice wasn't steady. "You've been carrying this like it was a crime. You raised me. You faced down a government man in the snow over me. You lost your whole standing in this country over me, and you never once threw it in my face." She wiped her eyes hard, angry at them for leaking. "And you've spent 10 years thinking you robbed me because you didn't shove me out the door towards strangers across a line on a map I've never seen. You old stupid," she couldn't finish it. "I should have given you the choice," I said. "Years ago. It was yours to make, not mine to delay. That was the whole of what Ramon asked, and I half broke it every day." "Then give it to me now," she said. "I'm 17, I can choose now." She held up the paper. "So that's what this is, a choice. You're not holding the door shut anymore, old man. It's open, I can see it's open." She looked at me, and there was something in her face I've never had words for, love and grief and a terrible grown-up clarity all at once. "But you have to mean it. If you give me this choice, you have to mean it all the way. You can't give it to me with a string on it. That's the only way it counts." "No string," I said, and I made myself say the rest, the part that was going to cost me whatever I had left to pay. "If you want to look for him, your uncle, your people, I'll take you. I'll spend whatever's left and ride wherever it leads, and I won't say one word to weight the scale, because the scale's yours. And if you find them and they're yours and you want to stay with them," my voice did the thing it does, "then you'll go and I'll come home and I'll be glad for you, and that'll be the right end of it, even though it'll about kill me. That's me meaning it all the way. That's the bill come due, in the acutes. I've owed it to a dead man for 10 years, and I'm paying it to you now, in full." She looked at me a long time. "In full," she said, soft, and something passed across her face like she'd heard an echo of words said over a forgiven debt a lifetime ago, words she couldn't have known about, written in a ledger in a hand she'd corrected the arithmetic of. "All right, in full." We went north and west that summer. It took most of 3 months and most of my savings, and it aged me about 5 years, and I would not trade 1 mile of it for anything I own. I won't lay out the whole of the search, the false trails and the agents who wouldn't talk and the agents who would, and the long days following a fatting thread across country that the maps had been busy unnaming for a generation. I'll only tell you that we found them. Not easy and not whole. Half a lifetime of erasing had done its work, and the band was scattered to a hard place on the far side of everything. But we found people who'd known her mother, and an old woman who remembered the winter the band had gone south and lost some of its number in the snow, and at the end of the thread, alive, gray, stooped, exactly where a dying woman had whispered he'd be a decade and more before her mother's brother. Her uncle, living, the if had landed on the right side. I stood back for that. It wasn't mine. I held the horses and watched from a distance while a 17-year-old girl who'd come to me eating stale bread in silence stood in front of an old man who had her mother's face folded into his own old face, and I watched her hand him the paper in the red cloth, and I watched him read her mother's name in a friend's dead wife's hand, and put his face in his hands the way Rahman had, the way grief makes everyone the same shape in the end. They talked days of it. I gave them the days. I made camp at a distance and I tended the horses and I did my arithmetic out of long habit and got it wrong twice because there was no one there to catch me, and I waited, and I did not weight the scale, and it was the hardest waiting of my whole hard life, harder than the calving, harder than Brant, harder than 9 years of an empty house, because I knew the answer might be the one I'd promised to be glad of, and I knew I'd have to be glad of it, and I didn't know if I had the glad in me or only the breaking. On the 4th day, she came and sat by my fire. "They want me to stay," she said. I kept my eyes on the fire. I figured they might. "My uncle's getting old, there's children. It's mine this, I can feel it being mine. The way you said, the floor I was supposed to be standing on the whole time, it's real and it's here and they're holding the door open same as you did." She picked up a stick and turned it in her hands, a grown woman's version of the small girl who'd left me feathers. "And I keep thinking about what you said, that you'd be glad, that it'd be the right end of it even though it'd about kill you." I meant it, I had to work to say it. "I mean it now, this is yours, you should." "Let me finish, old man, you never let me finish." But her voice was gentle. I sat with that, with staying. And then I thought about the ranch in the dark of morning and the dog waiting at the barn and your terrible arithmetic that I have to fix every month, and I thought about who'd catch your mistakes when you can't see the ledger anymore. Because you're getting old, Wendell. You're getting old and stubborn, and you'll work yourself into the ground out there alone and somebody has to be there to make you stop. She looked up at me and her eyes were wet and steady both at once. And I realized the choice you gave me wasn't between 2 doors. It was between 2 homes. And the thing I figured out sitting with my uncle's people for 4 days is that I don't have to choose one and lose the other. That's the lie the world told me my whole life, that I had to be one thing and cut the other out. You're the one who taught me that was a lie. You taught it to me by using both my names. I didn't dare speak. "So here's what I choose." She'd thought it through, of course she had. She kept books. She'd balanced this the way she balanced everything. "I'm going to come and go. I'm going to spend part of my years here learning what's mine, what they can teach me before my uncle's gone and it's gone with him. And I'm going to spend part of my years there with you on the ranch because that's mine too and you're mine too, and I'm not handing either one back to the world that spent so long trying to take them from me." She threw the stick in the fire. "Both. I choose both. And if that's not a choice you can live with, old man, then you shouldn't have raised a girl smart enough to find a 3rd door when you only showed her 2. I have promised you the truth all the way through this, and I'll keep to it here at the end. I did not say anything wise. I did not say anything at all. I sat by a fire on the far side of everything, and I wept like the stone I used to be had finally, fully, after 60 years, learned how. And she came around the fire and put her arms around me. A grown woman now, taller than her mother in the photograph her uncle had, holding her old fool of a rancher together the way I'd once held her. And the dog we'd brought along pressed in against us both. And the country that had spent a generation unnaming everything could not, for that one night, unname that. I'm an old man now, older than I had any right to expect. Ineacutes kept her word, the way she's kept every word since she was old enough to give one. She comes and goes. There are stretches, sometimes long ones, where she's north with her uncle's people, and the house goes quiet again, and I tend the place and do my arithmetic and get it wrong and there's nobody to catch me, and I feel the old loneliness press in at the windows like weather. And then there's a morning when I come out at the dark of it and there's a horse in the yard I know, and a tall figure waiting at the barn, and she'll say something sharp about how I've let the place go, and the loneliness lifts off like frost in the sun, and I'm so glad I can hardly speak, which she counts on, because it lets her win the argument before I've found my words. The record Brant spoke of never came to anything in the end. The world changed, slow and not enough but some, and the schools that stole children got named for the theft they were, late, too late for most, and a man's name in a government book turned out to be a seed that, this once, never came up. We were lucky. I know we were lucky. I know how many other children and how many other snows had no Ramon to find them, and no stubborn fool to shut a door against a buggy. And the luck of us doesn't square the unluck of them. And I've stopped trying to make that sum balance because some sums don't, and a man has to learn to live with an open account. The ledger's still in the drawer. The cigar box beside it, the stones, the feathers, the red cloth that's been folded by 5 sets of hands now and counting, because there's a small one in her uncle's camp she leaves stones for, the way she once left them for me. And the line I never crossed out, October 9th, owed $214, settled in full. I understand it now, that line, in a way I couldn't the morning I wrote it, thinking I was doing something large by forgiving a debt. I had it backwards, the way I had most things backwards for most of my life. I thought Ramon had come to me owing money and had paid me with a child because he had nothing else. I thought I was the one being paid, in some currency I was too hard to understand at the time. But that's not the sum. The sum is this. A dying man owed me $214, and instead he handed me the whole of the rest of my life. He looked at the emptiest, hardest, most balanced man he knew, and he saw a room with space in it, and he put into that room the one thing that could fill it, and in doing so he didn't pay a debt, he forgave one. Mine. The debt I'd run up over 9 years of deciding that needing no one was the same as being safe, the debt of a life spent keeping everything and holding nothing. He paid that off, with a child eating bread in the dark, watching to see if the world had any reason left to be trusted. Settled in full. I won't see many more autumns. I know it the way Ramon knew it, plain like it looks like rain. When I go, Ineacutes will bury me up the draw by the cottonwoods, near Ramon, near the dogs, and she'll say words over me. And they'll be better words than the ones I borrowed for him, because she's better with words than I ever was, better with everything, and she'll mean them. And that's all a man can ask. She came home last week. There's a horse in the yard, I know. I haven't told her yet how little time the doctor in town gives me. I keep meaning to. I keep finding the mornings too bright, or she's laughing at my arithmetic, or there's a stone left fresh on my pillow that I'm too busy holding to set down and say the hard thing. I'll tell her. There's a way she goes quiet and small when she's bracing for grief, the way she did as a child, and Ramon told me long ago that's when she needs me loud, and I mean to be loud for her one last time, mean to tell her it's all right, that the account's been balanced for years, that she was never a thing I kept but the whole reason I